Greetings, enlightened viewers, and welcome to another Roll Off a Tangent Symposium. I'm Robert Gibson, alias Zendexor, and my co-hosts are Anthony Simeone and XJ. Today we shall discuss what is perhaps the most original of the invented worlds of Clark Ashton Smith. One of the delights of Smith's work is that so many of his colourful fantasy tales can be grouped in series, building up a composite picture in which the reader can explore one facet after another of the world in question, as his imagination rambles, for example, among the 10 Averoigne stories, the 10 Hyperborea stories, the 16 Zothique stories. Now, for Xiccarph, there are only 2 stories in the Xiccarph series, which is a pity as it shows the author's capacity for pure invention, completely unconnected to known worlds or known legend. Smith puts you on that world without any framing device or dream or reincarnation or any kind of transplanted Terran viewpoint. I might add that this is also true of the planet Lo-Fi in The Demon of the Flower, but he never wrote a sequel to that tale, so Lo-Fi can't qualify as a series, whereas Xiccarph definitely does, all the more so in that its 2 stories vary considerably in imagery and mood. The first one, The Maze of Maal Dweb, is a dark tale of tyrannous sorcery. Maal Dweb is an omnipotent wizard who rules the world of the Xiccarph system with a power so absolute that one feels not even a Conan type hero would have a chance against him. Compare the way Conan is given an opening by his magician opponents. They either let down their guard while stoned on the fumes of the Black Lotus, as in the Hour of the Dragon, or Conan finds another magician who allies with him against the enemy, as in the Scarlet Citadel. But Maal Dweb has no weaknesses and no rivals, and the simple warrior Tiglari, who comes to the sorcerer's stronghold seeking to rescue a maiden, has no prospect of success. So why does one keep reading this saga of hopelessness? Partly it's the sheer power of the setting, and partly perhaps a haunting sense that Tiglari's defeat is not total, that Maal Dweb himself, in partially reducing the warrior's punishment, must have felt respect for his bravery, or even gratitude for the way the doomed attempt at rescue has varied the monotony of a life of one who possesses unassailable power. The problem of how to occupy your time if you are an unchallengeable ruler is further explored in the second story, The Flower Women, in which Maal Dweb, seeking a cure for ennui, goes looking for danger. We are shown his marvellous planetarium, in which hung an array of various globes that represented the 3 suns, the 6 planets, and the 13 moons of the system ruled by Maal Dweb. Some whim makes him examine the globe of the outermost planet, Votalp, and as he gazes at it, fantastic sceneries leapt into momentary salience, taking on the definitude and perspective of actual landscapes, and then faded back amid the iridescent blur. Finally, looking at all this, he notices a situation that catches his interest. After deliberately reducing his powers, he goes off on an expedition, crossing a trans-dimensional bridge that brings him to Votalp, where he finds adventure. We see him in the course of the tale rescuing an innocent sisterhood of floral vampires from the threat posed by an evolving race of scientific lizards. And so, for the time being at any rate, risk-taking has banished boredom from Maal Dweb's life. A useful lesson should any of us get too powerful. And with that, I now refer you to my powerful colleague for their comment.
Well, thank you, Rob. That was a very detailed and great introduction to the story. I would like to say that the two stories. Well, first of all, I really liked the two stories. It had great flavor in the setting, and I particularly liked the first story didn't grab me as much, but the second story surely did. I really liked the flower women. That was quite original, I must say. Never quite came across a setup like that, that I can recall anyway. I have to confess, the first story did bear a striking resemblance in the flavor of it with the demon flower, I have to say. It really, like, when I was reading it, I was like, is this the same world as the demon flower? But obviously it's not. It's a completely different planet. And I also have to confess, I keep messing up the this is just a totally a me thing, the name of the guy, Maal Dweb. I keep messing it up in my name, in my head, and I keep thinking Muad'Dib, which is in a different story altogether. But yeah, I really like the it's very hard to describe the feeling it gives off, like the vibe. It at once has a very expensive but also very desolate feeling to the two stories. Like, it's almost like a very hopeless. The first story had a very hopeless feel to it, like, just from because the story starts from the perspective of the warrior I'm gonna butcher the name.
Tiglari.
Tiglari, yeah. Tiglari, which has a very Mayan feel to it. I feel like feels like that the name is drawn from that source. It just has a very hopeless, desolate feeling. It feels a little bit like those like when he's like walking through the palace of Maal Dweb. I have to be careful not to call him the Muad'Dib. Like when he's like creeping through the palace, it really does give me the sense of like it felt like one would see like a palace of a sorceress that one would see in maybe not Conan, but it reminded me a little bit of Khal the Conqueror, that the wizard with the 1,000 mirrors or something like that we have also done in this podcast before. And and Clark Ashton Smith had done very well in creating a sense of invincibility around the sorcerer himself, and it's just like whatever Tiglari did was basically futile, and so that was what gave me the sense of desolation. And then we move on to the second story, which then switched perspective to the sorcerer himself, and that became way more fanciful because all of a sudden we are no longer in that very desolate because from his perspective nothing is unachievable, and he's so bored that he basically like had to how we say it, debuff himself to find a challenge. Yeah. And I do like how much more potential there is to this universe, because there's like what, 3 planets? 6
planets.
6 planets. That's like 6 planets to explore, and that's like a ton of different things that could have happened in that six planets. It's just a pity that Clark Ashton Smith never explored it further, of course. But hey, that's what pastiches are for, right? And fan novels. Well, that's my 2 cents. I quite like the story, but let's hear what Anthony has to say.
Yeah, I was telling Robert before we started the show today that the more I read of Clark Ashton Smith's work, the more I want to read it, and I'm regretting not starting sooner. And they republished a lot of his work in a series of collections, maybe all of his complete short stories across a number of collections. And I really want to go back and explore. Maybe Robert can edify us as to how often maybe he revisited some of these worlds, or it seems like he created over his career a lot of different worlds, and I don't know how all they're connected, but it seems like they maybe should. But in reading these two stories, I was just overcome again by the sense of surrealness that he creates, the surreality, if that's a word, of it all, and the lyrical nature of his prose. So he really has a way of transporting you to these realms, and partially maybe just because he uses such eloquent, flowery words. Yeah, he really, as the kids might say, well, at least the kids in my generation, because my kids don't know what a thesaurus is, but he really broke out the thesaurus,
I
as we used to say.
Sorry to interrupt. I'd like to ask: is this one of his earlier works, like the first story?
Maybe Robert can edify us on that count, because
Well, it's strange, but as a matter of fact, there's the publication dates here. The Maze of Maal Dweb came out at Weird Tales October 1938,
Mm-hmm.
which is quite late for a Clark Ashton Smith story. Most of them were sort of 1930 to 1936 sort of thing. But The Flower Women came out in 1935, Weird Tales, May 1935. So what order they were written, I don't know, but certainly the second story was published before the first.
That is interesting because
weird.
I felt, and this is the reason for my interruption. I felt like the first story, the Maze of Maal Dweb,
Maal Dweb,
Maal Dweb.
yeah.
The first
Maal
story,
Dweb.
the first story was felt rougher than the second. It felt like some of the words were thrown in there for the sake of being in there. It wasn't flowery the way I'm used to in Clark Ashton Smith's story. It felt more bombastic rather. But back to you guys. Sorry for my interruption.
No, it's okay. No, it's interesting because, yeah, it really seemed like that publication order is strange, and who knows, sometimes one story can be rejected, and then, maybe just the publishing order. I'd really like to maybe dig into that myself after a time, just to dig into that. But they really flowed together. I mean, it seemed like, and spoiler territory from here, definite spoiler territory. If you're listening, stop here and go back and read the stories, and then come back. You can find them pretty freely available online. But in reading, they just flowed. I mean, it was just, he defeated Tiglari. Maal Dweb defeated Tiglari's, penetration into his fortress so easily. And then he's just struck, like you said, Robert, with this ennui. He's super powerful. He has no challengers. So as you said, XJ has to debuff himself and strip himself of his magical powers and devices. And for the second story, and go out and encounter the flower women, who almost overcome him with their sorceress powers. They're sort of like sirens. But just in reading these stories, I was reminded of the best of Jack Vance and his stories of the dying earth, and that it was a similar experience I had in reading those. It was this lyricism, this poetry, this almost like prose poetry that you don't get, I feel like, in a lot of the modern stripped down sort of grim dark stories, the fantasy that we read today, that's popular today. It just that harkening back to that lyricism of Jack Vance and just the following this journey of this doomed warrior who's totally overmatched, and he's really sort of seems like a primitive. He smears himself in this goop that the creatures in the on the planet and the dwelling of Maal Dweb are repulsed by, but only to it has no effect on Maal Dweb himself. And again, spoilers, but just that towards the end where Tiglari is sort of metamorphosed into the creatures that throughout the story, the ape-like creatures that Tiglari was trying to avoid and repulse with the goop. He gets transformed into one of these similar creatures, but out of some impulse, it seemed like Maal Dweb thought it was mercy. He left Tiglari's head untransformed, so he's got this weird ape body, this grotesque ape body with the head of a man still on his head, and Maal Dweb is doing him a favor. I don't know. So, but just that you could just feel at the end, Maal Dweb is kind of monologuing, and he's talking to all he's surrounded by is his servants, his automatons, who are just unthinking and they just praise him. So it's like he's this god, this bored god who he says, "Am I not Maal Dweb?" Something to paraphrase. And he says, "Yes." The automaton says, "You are Maal Dweb, the all powerful." And he just really has no equal in this solar system he rules. So he has to go out and throw himself into harm's way, and strip himself of his powers in some way to kind of go out and explore his solar system realm. It's amazing, these stories that from early 20th century from these creators like Vance, like Clark Ashton Smith. And I think maybe the latest example was the Torturer Tales. But was that Glenn Cook? I'm trying to remember if that was Gene Wolfe. I always get them mixed up. Yeah, Gene Wolfe's the Shadow of the Torturer, those stories where they're just fantastical, but those take place in a distant future, the Dying Earth and the Torturer stories from Gene Wolfe. But I wonder if that's what we're encountering with Clark Ashton Smith. But regardless, I mean, yes, it was just once again, I mean, his story. I need to delve really into his tale more, Clark Ashton Smith, going forward, because every time I read them, I'm just stunned by his lyricism. And I'm a fan of those the older prose and the more arcane and obscure occult prose, so to speak, from back in the day. And I don't know how much modern readers, younger readers, will get from that. But XJ, you being the youngest, I think, of the three of us right now, seems like you enjoyed it. So maybe that
I can't speak for my contemporaries, I have to say.
Okay.
I do enjoy good prose. I am a big fan of the first Patrick Rothfuss book, simply because of the way the prose was constructed.
The name of the wind. The name of the wind.
The name
right?
of the wind. I'm not too taken with the story itself. I don't particularly resonate. None of the characters particularly resonate with me, except the small section describing how poor Kuwait is as a student, because that is quite literally my experience as a university student.
Yeah.
I think he captured that very well, probably because Rothfuss himself went through a period like that in his life. It really felt like that. And but then again, I also thoroughly enjoyed these two short stories. And Maal Dweb is about as one-dimensional and flat a character as they come. He's quite flat.
Sure, we've seen that trope a million times, right?
Yeah.
The puissant sorcerer, the sorcerer who's all powerful and
But
is
it's okay.
nigh
But
on.
it's okay to me because how flat he is allows the world building to come out in such great flavor. Yeah, because he's
Agreed.
clearly he's just really there to show us to contrast the very colorful world that he inhabits. Like, he himself is pretty flat, but it gives a great contrast to it. Allows him to not take over the world building, I feel. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Mm.
So, Robert, this was your story that you wanted us to read, so I wanted to get your thoughts on the stories as well. Please let us know
Yeah,
your thoughts.
I thought I'd mention the comparison with the planet Lo-Fi in The Demon of the Flower, because XJ brought that up. I think the great difference is that Lo-Fi is a world of rhythm. There's there's a continual dominant rhythm with these plants that writhe backwards and forwards, sway backwards and forwards. And you don't get that on Xiccarph at all. Xiccarph is more, shall we say, less unified, except for the power of Maal Dweb. That's the only feeling one gets, that the world is unified in that way, and in no other. Whereas lo-fi, you get the impression the geography of it is just dominated by all these swaying plants. Anyway, so onward to oh, and Anthony mentioned Gene Wolfe's The Book of the New Sun series, and I would say that the tone, actually, I hadn't thought of this myself, but yes, there is a sort of, not exactly similarity, but a relation between the tones of Clark Ashton Smith and Gene Wolfe's far future work. Although it has to be said that the latter, the Book of the New Sun, is science fiction. There isn't any actual magic in it, as far as I can remember. It's science fiction, but it's, as it were, science fiction which has acquired the overtones of magic simply because of the immense lapse of time and the lack of what we think of as technology, because all the metal has been used up. So you can't have a machine culture anymore.
Mm.
Anyway,
Yeah.
be that as it may, interesting point that XJ made about the flatness of Maal Dweb's character. It just goes to show that in a story like this, you can't really separate the character from the setting. The character and the setting are, it's such close symbiotic relationship that, as XJ pointed out, the one is used to illuminate the other. And another issue that comes from that is that the two stories are dominated by, shall we say, the picturesque, the theme of the kind of visual theme, which means that it really is the only thing that makes them morally bearable. This, otherwise, you'd be continually fuming with indignation at this monstrous political system, which is about the worst you could possibly have, of a world ruled by a sorcerer whose slightest whim is not only law but achievable and bound to be carried out. So,
It's interesting that you use the word political system, because he isn't even governing. He's just like sitting in his palace
yeah,
demanding tribute. It's like, you're
yeah,
Yeah, he's
right. It's
just
like the
a
worst thing
despot.
ever.
Yeah, just
yeah,
a magical despot. Yeah.
yeah. But exactly. But rather than fume with indignation about that, one just listens. Well, one reads it all as though one were listening to a piece of music, and it's visual music, and well, it's also the music of the prose, the rhythm of the prose, and the vocabulary, and therefore the moral issue doesn't really arise. Well, it arises in odd little ways, in that whenever Maal Dweb has a slight impulse of movement towards something that he thinks of as mercy or kindliness, you think to yourself, "Oh, good old Maal Dweb, you know, he's coming on here. He's showing a few promising signs." And certainly in the second story, he's almost like a hero against these unprepossessing lizard folk, the Ispahars, who are definitely actively cruel, and the way they just rip up these feminine plants and throw them down and use them to make some sort of concoction in their laboratory. And that brings me finally to another point, which is that although it's fantasy and not science fiction, the tone, the picturesque tone of certain sorts of science fiction is made use of in the second story. The laboratory and the scientific ambitions of the lizards. It's just another aspect of the mood music of the story. I think that was very well done. Smith, the author, would definitely not have liked a scientific machine-based culture. He was definitely not into that. So perhaps some of that dislike comes in through the second story.
Well, despite that, he has written some fantastic science fiction story, hasn't he? The Venus stories were pretty good.
Yep, they were, but they were not stories about a machine culture, although you needed a machine culture to get there.
Yeah, that's fair enough. But he does not shy away from writing about those. Is perhaps a sign of another sign of his capabilities as a writer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this story struck me as, I guess if you want, I'm not a huge fan of labels, but I mean, to just clarify things for in our minds, like it struck me as Sword and Planet. So it seemed almost Barsoomian. It seemed almost like Mars stories by so the Mars stories written by, oh gosh, I'm drawing a blank. I'm having a senior moment, fellas. Who wrote the Mars stories? The Barsoom, was that I don't want to say. Yes, Burroughs. Yeah, Burroughs. Oh, geez. Ah, yeah. So too many authors in my head today. But yeah, it reminded me very much of the fantastical sort of. It seemed like it was super science potentially to me. So again, the Asimov, sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So it seems like when I read these stories, I'm like, is it magic? Is it the far future? Are these just alien beings he's encountering? And Maal Dweb is a sorcerer powered by super science, so advanced it seems like magic, or is it magic? I guess it really doesn't matter in the end. But just like you said, this is very picaresque. It's just the journey and the wonders that Clark Ashton Smith show you are the story. It's just his sheer invention it was just amazing, as you're reading it, and just the things that he comes up with. And it's just this, and I try to always equate things, for better or worse, to gaming. So I'm imagining, running a solo adventure where someone's the adventurer, is playing Tiglari as the player character, and he's going through and just seeing these trippy events around him, surrounding him, and having someone describe that to you, just putting myself into Tiglari's shoes and just encountering these wondrous and horrible scenes and creatures and visions. And it's just really transports you with his language and just the wonder of his invention, and just traveling through these realms, both Tiglari and then Maal Dweb himself in the second story. It really is a roller coaster ride of surrealness that's I was really appreciating.
Yeah, and I have to, and I actually kind of like noticed, like, well, I don't know if that's quite the right word, but the two stories are very different in their structure, even though the tone is very, like, basically flows from one to the other. And that is, like, the first story had a very traditional structure to it. It is basically you could find it in a dozen fairy tales, quite literally, like Beauty and the Beast, but in reverse. You have a innocent village woman sacrificed to the dragon, and then the hero comes into a maze. except he didn't defeat the dragon, of course, in this story. The second story, the Flower Women, is completely different though. It was just like it was the structure was that of a bored god traipsing around the mortal realms or something like that. I cannot think offhand of a trope like that. So it's also really interesting, like the contrast between the two, and the fact that the second story flowed immediately from the first is rather interesting to me. And the fact that the second story was published first also like just raises like some real interesting questions in my mind about how Clark Ashton Smith wrote this two stories. Did he write it back to back? Did he write the first a long time ago but was rejected, as Anthony suggested, or did he write the first after he wrote the second, which would be really strange, really strange. Yeah.
Did he write a prequel? Yeah.
Yeah.
Did he write a prequel to the Maal Dweb adventure story? You know, it's interesting.
Yeah, what we need is somebody to write a biography of Clark Ashton Smith.
It's true. We don't really know a hell of a lot about Clark Ashton Smith, don't we?
Yeah. I mean, Robert E. Howard, author of Conan, has had a biography written. I forget what the title of the biography is. And Lovecraft has had more than one biography, but Smith hasn't had one yet, so far as I know. And maybe that's a problem with the sources, and that although there are loads and loads of letters between him and Lovecraft that would help, they only cover a relatively short period, I think. And Smith outlived the other two Weird Tales giants considerably. And for that period, I don't know what one could do if one were a biographer. I really don't know. So
it is very interesting that not a lot is known about Clark Ashton Smith. And I have to be like honest, like even something wrong with my mic here, even like a lot of nerds that I know would know of Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft, and they would have read extensively on this too, but not everyone knows who Clark Ashton Smith is. And that is such a shame, because he is, in my mind, he is a much better writer. He has let me rephrase that. He has a much better command of the language than the other two. That is in my opinion.
Yeah, it does look like there's someone, it's on Amazon, someone named Steve Behrens has written something called Clark Ashton Smith, A Critical Guide to the Man and His Work. So looks like there is some sort of biography. It was published in 2013, so 220 pages. So it might be something to check out.
Yeah.
Could be worth checking out, yeah.
Yeah.
I think
but go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, as far as who's the best writer out of the three musketeers of Weird Tales, Smith, Lovecraft, and Howard, the way I solve that is by saying to myself, how excited would I be if a new volume by one of those writers was suddenly unearthed? And I think I have to say that although I'd be excited by any of them, I'd be most excited if a new volume of Clark Ashton Smith stories were discovered.
Likewise.
Indeed.
Because for me, it would be because if it's with Clark Ashton Smith, I would be absolutely certain that it's going to be very different from anything that he had ever written, because he doesn't seem to stick to one world for very long. Whereas with Robert E. Howard, it would likely be a Conan, and while I don't have I would be absolutely up to devouring Robert E. Howard Conan story, but I would be much more interested in whatever fantastic visions that Clark Ashton Smith would have came up with. And I have to say, not excited at all about H.P. Lovecraft. He's a very good writer, but he tends to write in only one note, which is bleak.
Whoa,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah, I would agree there. Yeah, I think it does seem like, I mean, again, he offers us fantastical things in his stories, with Conan and with Kull and his other characters, but yeah, they all tend to be sort of that, they're all in, turned up to 11, and it's all it seems like there's no time for contemplation, and if it is, it's just to contemplate like the strange degenerate, beings that the slayer comes to kill, right? Or the oddities or the foul things, whereas there's a sense of wonder that I feel like you don't get when you're reading Robert E. Howard stories. Clark Ashton Smith is just this sense of wonder and sorcery. I mean, it's sort of like he's writing whereas Conan is against sorcery. He usually is, he fears sorcery, he mistrusts sorcery, and rightly so. But it seems like Clark Ashton Smith, by contrast, writes from the perspective of the sorcerers. So if that's the big contrast between them, it's the sorcerer's perspective versus Conan the Barbarian or Kull's perspective, the
I mean,
non-sorcerer.
if I were to liken it to food, I would say that if you are the type that really likes a certain type of dish and you want to go back to it over and over again, but better, then you would probably be very excited about Robert E. Howard, a new thing unearthed, that is written by Robert E. Howard. However, if you are the type that wants to try a different variety from time to time, then Clark Ashton Smith is your boy.
Yeah, Conan and Robert E. Howard is sort of meat and potatoes, and Clark Ashton Smith is like Indian food. I don't know. It's like, yeah,
Indeed.
it's,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's like meat pie versus Indian food. I don't know.
It's
You can
like
get
something different every time. Yeah.
yeah.
Would be the way I would describe it. And I don't know how to describe a fan of H.P. Lovecraft. I think it's very clear by now. I recognize his capabilities as a writer and his genius and his impact, but I am clearly not a H.P. Lovecraft fan.
I
Yeah.
am actually. I think the thing that's special about Lovecraft, I think, is that in a way I take him more seriously. He's the only one of the three that I actually can take seriously as an explorer of reality, which may seem like a bit a way out thing to say.
No, I absolutely see where you're coming from, because H.P. Lovecraft writes things that are like the kind of his mood is like the things at the corner of your eyes in a very dark room kind of feeling, like almost as if it's going to reach out and grab you, kind of. So I could totally see it.
And he
Yeah.
does what the other two don't do, which is, well, they don't do it a lot. Is he mingles the everyday world with the fantastic, whereas Smith, well, he does that occasionally, but not in his most successful stories. In his most successful stories, especially the ones we've been talking about today, you get plonked right in the fantastic in its own terms. And as for Howard, well, he was a very multi-talented writer. I think his best work is perhaps the Conan stories, although I've read some pretty good other stuff by him. But Howard was a master of English prose and a unexcelled adventure writer. I suppose adventure is the key to Howard, and it's not so much a key to the other two. The other two are more, I don't know, states of mind, states of being, picturesqueness. But for actually getting from point A to point B, you can't beat Howard.
No, that's true. Well, my biggest issue with H.P. Lovecraft is, I think, pretty well established by now. I have difficulty distinguishing each story from the other because they're all so alike to me.
I was going to say that. I was going to tease you a bit about that, but you've just admitted it. So I won't bother.
Indeed, guilty as charged.
Yeah, I mean, in Howard's stories, it is the individual. He shows the individual hero standing against the horrors of reality, whereas Lovecraft is the horrors of reality are indomitable. You can't overcome the cosmic horror. So his characters sort of are all interchangeable, paper thin, because they don't matter. His characters are just there to fall victim. Any characters are there are one-dimensional because they're just there to fall victim to his multi-dimensional creatures that have much more detail to them. The Cthulhu mythos creatures are much more interesting than the humans that they devour. The
Yes.
humans are just there to be victimized and destroyed and devoured, and their sanity ripped away. Whereas Howard is like it's the individual is more the Conan is so vividly described, or the Cull, or the other characters are just so vivid. They stand against the cosmic horror of reality. So I guess his existentialism of Robert Howard, versus H.P. Lovecraft's nihilism. It's existentialism versus nihilism. I don't know if you can make some of that.
Yeah. But on the other hand, if you look into it in detail, you can always find exceptions. In the Dunwich Horror by Lovecraft, the good guys actually win, although it's a considerable cost, but they do win, and they are quite interesting actually. But yeah, I take your point most of the time, Anthony. I take your point. Whereas with the stories we've been discussing today by Clark Ashton Smith, it's not so matter. It doesn't really so much matter who wins. It's the picture is so engrossing. You just read it for the picture and for being conducted on this amazing holiday in this planetary system of Xiccarph.
Yeah, you don't even have time. You don't have the time or the reason to contemplate, the surreality. I mean, whether or not it's existentialism or nihilism, you're just like, whoa, this is crazy. This is trippy.
Yeah, and I basically wasn't like, oh man, okay, this Maal Dweb guy is a bit of a beep, but you know what? I don't care. The world is so.
You totally call them Muad'Dib. It was inevitable.
Oh, wait, did I call him Maal Dweb? Okay, well.
It sounded like you did.
Maal
Dweb.
Dweb. The
Maal
dweeb.
Dweb.
I mean, the sorcerer himself is just like, oh wow, whatever. But like the world is so colorful. It's like,
yeah, so I read the stories. I usually try to do this. I read the stories that myself, and then I always look on YouTube to see if someone's read the story, any of these old stories, and he did. And there was one guy who was reading this, especially the Flower Women, and he just said when he came to the name, he really slowed down and said Maal Dweb. Like he would say the guy's name so slow and he would Maal Dweb, like it was an incantation or something.
So all of us it seems like I'm not the only one that has problems with the guy's name.
Maal Dweb.
However you say it.
Maal Dweb.
Yeah, just say it over and over.
Maal Dweb. Whatever.
Maal Dweb.
Yeah, the study of names there's a word for it, onomastics. Now, one could invent a word for somebody, the state in which you get where you can't pronounce a name properly, and it could be something like disonomastico or something like that. So, Sorry about that, XJ. But
No. I mean, I don't know why. It's probably just some wire in my head that's like crossed, and I just cannot stop thinking of it as like more deep.
Dune is so popular right now,
Yeah, I mean,
against all odds.
I don't know. Every time I come across his name when I'm reading, when I'm mind reading, and I'm like more deep.
But yeah, it's
Well, all right. So I guess that I don't have anything else to say about the two short stories other than that it's pretty good. And being as short as it is, I think everyone that has a chance to check it out should. Besides which, is completely free. Unlike perhaps the other two stories, which the other two authors, which you might not get it for free, but this one is completely free. And so yeah, highly recommended from me. What about the two of you? Do you have anything else to say about?
no, I would say highly recommend it as well. I guess all that's left is the scoring, right? I would give this. I mean, I would give the story. I'm saying I'm going to settle on 8.5. I would say for these two stories, which I think really need to be read together. Publication order notwithstanding, definitely want to dig in to try to see if I can discover the genealogy of the, so to speak, dig into some of the provenance of the stories and when they were published and why it seems that they were published out of the order that we seem to want to read them in or that they're traditionally read in. But I would say 8.5 for just again this my growing admiration for CAS's stories, Clark Ashton Smith, CAS for short, right? So yeah, just my growing admiration for him, and just like it makes me want to read more, and just the again his lyricism and the prose poetry of it all is just it continues to entrance me. So I would say do yourself a favor and spend it takes maybe about an hour and a half to read both of these, maybe an hour and 15 minutes to read both of these stories together, maybe 2 hours, I don't know, depending on your reading pace. But I think I slowed it down just to absorb, and I reread a
Yeah,
bunch of lines just to like
I mean,
re-experience
I finished
the
it in
line.
like 40 minutes. But
Yeah,
if I slow down and really savor the words, it would take
yeah,
about that time. Yeah.
yeah. So 8.5 for me. Who's next?
What about you,
one,
Rob?
one, one little detail. I think it was Anthony said, quoted the saying, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And he ascribed that to Asimov, but actually it was Arthur C. Clarke, I think, who said that.
Oh,
He
it
also,
was. I'm sorry. You're right. See, again, too many authors, too little brain.
just a minor
It was
point.
enough. Yes, that's right. That's right. That's
Was it
And
Arthur C.
in
Clarke.
was it in
Arthur
Rama that
C.
he said
Clarke.
that?
oh, I should think he may have said that before then, but I
Okay.
don't know. I don't know. But anyway,
Yes, Arthur C. Clarke. I get these guys
another,
all mixed up all the time.
yeah, another point, just embellishing what I said before about the picturesqueness. The idea, some writers managed to make the theme of evil just a sort of costume thing in the story rather than something that you take seriously. And that reminds me of Lee Brackett's, some of her Sword and Planet work, where particularly on her Mars, where there's ancient evils, but you don't really get it's not evil in reality. It's sort of costume evil, and none the worse for that. It works in the story. Now, for my scoring of these tales, it depends if I were to consider them separately, because I think the second one is a slightly more impressive than the first. I would give the Flower Women 10 and the Maze of Maal Dweb 9.5. But considering them together, I would just give a 10 for the duo.
Yeah, well, that's basically a perfect score from Rob. And
Indeed.
yeah, well, I mean, Clark Ashton Smith is a very good writer. For my case, I would score it. I would say I'm giving the lowest score. I'm giving it both stories an 8. But the reason I'm giving it a 8 is because I'm comparing it to his other stories, which is a little bit less. I would say the first story dragged down the total score a little bit. Yeah, because the first story felt a little bit odd. I like I said before, like the way, especially the beginning, some of the way the words are thrown together felt a little bit forced. It didn't have the same sort of smooth, suave feel that Clark Ashton Smith usually brings to his prose. So that lowers it a little bit, and the very traditional structure of the first story is kind of less interesting than the second story, which was just the sorcerer nerfing himself to go on an adventure. Yeah, well, so 8 from me, but still, nevertheless, it's much better than most stories I have read before. So highly recommended to anyone that has a little bit of spare time and appreciate good writing, like good mastery with the language. Yeah. And yeah, all right, I guess that about wraps up this episode. And I hope everyone has a great Christmas and a great New Year. And we look forward to seeing you sharing more stories with our audiences in the coming year. Goodbye.
Goodbye.